Hi, Diana. Thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So, you've been working for years as an advocate for criminal justice reform with the ACLU, specifically working on the legalization of marijuana. And now, as of a couple weeks ago, New Jersey has voted to legalize marijuana. And not only that, but you've been appointed as the chair of the Cannabis Regulatory Commission. So, how does it feel to not only see this happen, but to be playing such an important role in getting it there and implementing it?
It really was like a full circle moment for me as I was filling out my ballot and answering the question of like whether I wanted to legalize cannabis and being able to cast my vote on that question after I'd been fighting for that very moment, for the opportunity for the voters to the people to express their support for legalization. And so it was emotional for me, and it feels great.
You've been speaking up for people who don't always have a voice in either politics or policy. When did you decide that that's what you wanted to do with your career?
It's been a strange process. I went to law school, and there I became like firmly cemented in my desire to do public interest work, to advocate for the masses, to speak up for on behalf of those and in support of those who are historically marginalized. I became then interested specifically in cannabis policy because it was, as an interest that was rooted in criminal justice reforms and drug policy reform more broadly. So, because really, I think cannabis is one area where that illustrates how there's a cascading effect of that entanglement in the criminal justice system can have on people and their families, because an arrest for a marijuana offense doesn't just impact the individual. All right, you're taking somebody out of, that person might not be able to get a job afterwards, so you're taking people out of the labor force. That person can lose their financial aid for their education, so now you're affecting their ability to get educated. And these are things that affect whole families and whole communities. And so I think it's really incumbent upon us to make sure that we're using evidence-based policies to guide our decisions here. And for far too long, the war on drugs was not evidence-based, and it left nothing but devastation and harm behind.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that people are becoming more open to hearing about how what they've been told for years and years might not be what actually was happening?
It's gotten a lot easier to have those conversations, and I think as more and more states join the movement for legalizing marijuana, folks are realizing that the sky is not falling in those states, but it can be hard. It is not an easy task to undo messaging of decades,
Right.
decades of sophisticated PR and legal apparatuses. It's not an easy feat. It doesn't happen overnight. What has been eye-opening for me is how open so many people are to being challenged and challenging their own previous views, and being willing to do something new.
That communication is a skill that I'm sure a lot of people wish they had just for either their day-to-day life or their own career. Do you have any tips for how to communicate with people?
Well, I think the first rule is knowing your audience, right? So knowing who you're trying to convince and what's important to them, and then finding a way to connect whatever you are advocating for or whatever issue you're working on. Find a way to connect that with the value that person cares about. And I think a lot of people really care about hearing how individuals are affected in real life by a certain issue. And so humanizing stories, humanizing issues can be really powerful, and it can bring out a lot in folks, people who had never really given it a thought. And I think people do inherently care about one another, and want to not do harm. And so I think it's important to make sure that you give people an avenue, something tangible that they can do to help undo harms.
When you are talking to people about this issue, what do you usually find it makes people hesitate and not want to, say yes and get on board with it?
In my experience as a cannabis advocate, some of the most common arguments against legalization were really kind of relics of the messaging of the war on drugs, right? This idea that all drugs are bad. If you use drugs, you're a bad person. We should not be legalizing these illicit substances. And I challenged those folks with a little bit of history knowledge, which is that the war on drugs, we now know, it's been publicly acknowledged that the war on drugs was deliberately crafted to target Black communities and others, right? And there are historical documents that indicate that even medical professionals were not fully convinced that cannabis needed to be prohibited to begin with. So once folks start to understand a little bit about the history of cannabis prohibition, and they then start to understand why mass incarceration is such an issue, they start to understand how cannabis legalization really is a part of the much larger criminal justice reform conversations that people are having across the country. But I definitely recognize that some people still aren't convinced yet. Some people may never be convinced that what we're doing is the right thing. And I say to those folks that I don't expect that everything will go perfectly well, perfectly smooth, starting on day one. I expect this to be a constant learning process, just as every other state has encountered in their own journeys. New Jersey's gonna figure this out, and I think we'll constantly be evaluating and modifying our systems to make sure that we are protecting, first and foremost, protecting public health and public safety, protecting patient access to medicinal cannabis, and also, providing meaningful opportunities for people to reap the benefits of a new industry, a new burgeoning industry that can provide jobs, can provide some revenue for reinvesting into our communities, and change the way we see something that we didn't really see before.
Yeah. I've seen a lot of people kind of change their mind on the issue in the past couple of years, maybe, just because they learn a lot of new information, and you find out that it's a lot more complicated than just smoking marijuana or not. Like it's not just that choice. Marijuana officially becomes legal in January, correct?
Correct.
But you have a ton of work to do leading up to that. Can you tell me a little bit about what the first steps of the commission are going to look like?
Certainly. So even before we get to the commission's work, the legislature has a job to do now that the ballot question has passed. The legislature now has to pass a bill that seeks to enact the will of the voters here by legalizing cannabis and establishing some of the foundational parameters of what the industry and marketplace regulation will look like. once a bill is signed into law by the governor, then the Cannabis Regulatory Commission will take on the duties of regulating New Jersey's brand spanking new legal cannabis market for personal use. And it will also be regulating continuing the operations of the New Jersey Department of Health that up until now has been regulating and overseeing the medicinal cannabis market.
So for you specifically, what are some of the goals that you're going to be keeping in mind while you, I guess, kind of lead this commission into the next year and the future of this?
The vision that I have is that the commission would really use equity as the lens through which it does its regular work. I'm really excited about shaping something from the beginning here. Legalization has for a long time been, an issue of racial and social justice and economic justice. And now we have the opportunity to bring that to life and craft an industry that reflects the diversity of the communities that, the diverse communities that they represent.
New Jersey isn't the first state to do this, but I know that there are other states where there are pros and cons to how they've gone about that. So how exactly will you be looking to other places? Will that be something that you bring to the communities and kind of ask for their input on?
We've already been having conversations with regulators in other states, learning from their experiences. Having a dozen or so other jurisdictions go before us really does give us an opportunity to take what's happening well, what's going well in other places, bring it to New Jersey if appropriate, and then also to try something new here. And New Jersey really has an opportunity to stand out in making sure that the market and the industry is through and through representative of diversity and inclusion. We have an opportunity to reinvest into the futures of our communities with the revenue that would be gained from legal cannabis sales. And I think, giving community some voice here is also critically important. Community members have long been engaged in this conversation around cannabis legalization, and I see no reason for it to stop.
When you are talking to people about your work, are they usually surprised to hear about what you do? What's that reaction? I can't imagine saying I'm working to help New Jersey legalize marijuana gets a boring reaction.
It rarely does. Even from my own circle of like family and friends,
right.
I'll get like big reactions like, "Oh, okay," or some my extended family members who maybe weren't really convinced that this was the right the right policy to pursue. But they were always willing to engage in that dialogue and actually ask me questions about, okay, explain to me, why is this important? And then once people start to see the human element behind the laws, the human impact behind the disparate enforcement of those laws, then they start to realize that, yeah, this is important. And you don't have to use cannabis to support legalization. You don't have to use cannabis to understand why it's important for us to reform our drug policies.
That gives me a lot of hope, not only for the job that you're about to do. It's very obvious that this commission is in good hands, but just, the future and getting things done. So thank you so much for talking with me today. It was great.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.